Elvis Presley didn't have to be there. He was already the biggest star in America. But on a Sunday morning in 1957, he walked into a small black church in Memphis to hear Mahalia Jackson sing. He sat in the back trying not to be noticed. But Mahalia saw him. And in front of the entire congregation, she called him out. "Young man in the back, Elvis, come sing with me. Let's see if you know where this music really comes from." The church went silent. This was a test. And everyone knew it. What Elvis sang made Mahalia weep and say, "This boy's got the anointing." To understand what happened that Sunday morning, you need to understand who Mahalia Jackson was. She wasn't just a gospel singer. She was the voice of the civil rights movement. She'd sung at the March on Washington. She'd sung for presidents and kings. Her voice carried the pain and hope of an entire people. When Mahalia sang, it wasn't entertainment. It was spiritual warfare. A cry from the soul that could move mountains and change hearts. Mahalia had watched Elvis's rise with mixed feelings. She saw a young white man singing black music, moving like the Pentecostal preachers she'd grown up watching, using the vocal techniques that came from the black church. Part of her was proud that this music she loved was reaching a wider audience. But part of her worried that it was being stripped of its spiritual foundation, turned into something commercial and empty. Elvis, for his part, had grown up in the church. Not the formal quiet services of white Southern churches, but the Pentecostal churches in Tupelo and Memphis, where black and poor white congregations would sometimes share services, where the music was loud and emotional and filled with the Holy Spirit. Elvis had learned to move by watching preachers shake with the Spirit. He'd learned to sing with emotion by hearing gospel singers pour their souls into hymns about salvation and suffering. But by 1957, Elvis was being criticized from all sides. White religious leaders said his music was the devil's work. Black musicians felt he was profiting from their culture. And Elvis, caught in the middle, was struggling with his own faith and identity. He'd been reading the Bible more, praying more, trying to figure out who he was beneath all the fame and controversy. That's why on a Sunday morning in March 1957, Elvis told his friends he wanted to go hear Mahalia Jackson. She was performing at a small church in South Memphis. Not one of the big venues she usually played, just a little church service where she was singing for the community she came from. Elvis's manager, Colonel Parker, told him it was a bad idea. A white rock star showing up at a black church in Jim Crow. Memphis could cause problems, could hurt his career, could be seen as a publicity stunt. Elvis went anyway. He put on a simple suit. No flashy colors or jewelry. He didn't tell the press. He just drove himself to the church and walked in quietly. He'd hoped to slip into a back pew unnoticed. But hoping to be unnoticed when you're Elvis Presley in 1957 was naive at best. The church was packed, about 300 people, all black except for Elvis. People noticed him immediately. Some smiled, welcoming. Some frowned, suspicious. A few whispered. But the service had already started, and Southern church manners meant you didn't make a scene during worship. So people let him sit down. Mahalia was in the middle of singing How I Got Over. And if you've never heard Mahalia Jackson sing, you can't imagine what it was like. Her voice wasn't just sound. It was power. It was a force that could shake the walls and shake your soul at the same time. She sang about struggle and survival, about making it through hard times by the grace of God. The congregation was on their feet clapping, calling back to her, caught up in the Spirit. Elvis sat in the back, tears already streaming down his face. This was the music he'd grown up with, the music he loved more than rock and roll, more than anything. This was home. Mahalia finished the song, and the church erupted in praise. As the noise died down, she took a sip of water and looked out at the congregation. That's when she saw him. Elvis Presley sitting in the back row, wiping his eyes, completely absorbed in the worship. What happened next? Nobody expected. Mahalia sat down her water and spoke directly to Elvis. "Young man in the back," she said, her voice carrying through the church without needing a microphone. "Elvis Presley, I see you back there." The church went absolutely silent. Every head turned to look at Elvis. He looked up startled like a child caught doing something he shouldn't. "Stand up, baby," Mahalia said not unkindly but firmly. Elvis stood slowly, his face red, unsure what was happening. "You come to my church, you come to hear gospel music that tells me something about your heart," Mahalia continued. "But I want to know something. All these people saying you took our music, made it into something else, got rich off our sound. I want to know the truth. Do you understand this music? Do you feel it? Or are you just a good mimic?" The question hung in the air. This wasn't hostile, but it was direct, and it was fair. Everyone in that church, everyone who'd watched Elvis's career, had wondered the same thing. "Come up here," Mahalia said, gesturing to the small stage at the front of the church. "Come sing with me. Let's see if you know where this music really comes from." Elvis hesitated. This wasn't like performing on stage for screaming fans. This was different. This was church. These were people for whom gospel music wasn't entertainment. It was survival than he'd ever seen in his life. The session musicians were skeptical at first. Street kid or not, this was Elvis's studio time, and they didn't want to waste it. But when Michael started singing, the room went silent. His voice, backed by professional musicians and recorded with studio-quality equipment, was nothing short of magical. He had the raw talent of early Elvis, combined with a modern sensibility that was entirely his own. Elvis stood in the control room watching through the glass as Michael sang Heartbreak Hotel with a pain and authenticity that gave Elvis goosebumps. "That boy's got it," said the producer. "Whatever it is, he's got it in spades." During a break-in recording, Michael mentioned something that caught Elvis's attention. "You know, Mr. Presley, I've been writing some songs too. Nothing fancy, just things that come to me when I'm playing on the street." "Let me hear one," Elvis said. Michael picked up his guitar and played a song he'd written called Memphis Rain. It was about loneliness, about watching the world go by from a street corner, about finding hope in the smallest kindnesses. When he finished, the studio was dead quiet. "Michael," Elvis said slowly, "that's not just a song, that's a hit." Elvis made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He decided to record Memphis Rain as a duet with Michael. The song captured something neither of them could have achieved alone. Elvis's legendary voice blended with Michael's raw emotion, creating something entirely new and powerful. When they finished recording, Elvis turned to Michael with a serious expression. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully. How would you feel about me helping you get a recording contract?" Not as Elvis Presley's protégé, but as Michael Chen, the artist. Michael looked at Elvis with tears in his eyes. 6 months ago, he'd been sleeping in doorways, wondering if he'd ever have a real chance at life. Now, the king of rock and roll was offering him a future he'd never dared to dream of. "Why are you doing this for me?" Michael asked. Elvis was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with a sincerity that surprised everyone in the room. "Because somebody did it for me once. A man named Sam Phillips took a chance on a poor kid from Tupelo who had a voice and a dream. And because I heard something in your voice that reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." Word of Elvis's duet with the street musicians spread quickly through Memphis and then across the country. Memphis Rain became an instant hit. But more importantly, it sparked a movement. Musicians across America started paying attention to street performers in a way they never had before. Record labels began scouting bus stations and subway platforms. The story of Elvis and Michael reminded the music industry that talent could be found anywhere. Michael Chen's first solo album debuted at number 3 on the Billboard charts. He used his success to start a foundation providing instruments and music lessons to homeless youth. But he never forgot that Tuesday afternoon on B Street when a chance encounter changed everything. "People ask me what it was like to meet Elvis," Michael said in interviews. But the truth is it wasn't about meeting a celebrity. It was about one human being recognizing something in another human being and deciding to help. That's the real magic of that day. Elvis kept the original recording of Michael singing Love Me Tender on the street corner. He'd had one of his bodyguards secretly record it from across the street, wanting to capture the pure, unfiltered moment before anything changed. Years later, after Elvis passed away, that recording was found among his most treasured possessions at Graceland. A note attached to it read, "This is what music is supposed to sound like, minus real and from the heart." Today, there's a small plaque on Beale Street marking the spot where Elvis discovered Michael Chen. But more importantly, the story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply pay attention to the people around us. The story of Elvis and Michael reminds us that talent doesn't always come with a spotlight and a stage. Sometimes it's sitting on a street corner hoping someone will listen. Elvis could have walked past that day. He could have enjoyed the performance and moved on. Instead, he chose to stop, to listen, and to act. In doing so, he didn't just change one young man's life. He reminded all of us that we have the power to recognize and nurture the gifts in others, no matter where we find them. Because you never know who might be sitting on a street corner playing their heart out, just waiting for someone to believe in them. The magic isn't in the celebrity or the fame. The magic is in the moment when one person decides to help another person chase their dreams. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. This incredible true story of compassion and the power of music shows us that talent can be found in the most unexpected places. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more amazing tales of when music legends changed lives. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their dreams matter, no matter where they're starting from. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's kindness completely changed another person's life? Let us know in the comments below. The opening lines of We Shall Overcome, the anthem of the civil rights movement. Elvis stood on that stage, visibly moved, tears running down his face as he listened to the crowd sing. The sweet inspirations joined in, their professional voices lifting above the crowd's earnest but imperfect harmonies. And then Elvis himself began to sing, his voice blending with theirs, and with the thousands in the arena, creating a moment that nobody present would ever forget. It wasn't a planned part of the show. It wasn't something they had rehearsed. It was simply what happened when people chose unity over division. When they chose to stand together rather than allow hate to win. When the spontaneous singing of We Shall Overcome finally ended, Elvis wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change the rest of the show. Instead of returning to suspicious minds where they had left off, instead of trying to recapture the energy they had before the interruption, he turned to the sweet inspirations and asked them what they wanted to sing. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how Elvis's shows were structured. But this wasn't a normal show anymore. Houston stepped forward to her microphone, conferred briefly with the other three women, and then said something to Elvis that the audience couldn't hear. Elvis nodded, walked to the band leader, and gave instructions. What happened next was unprecedented in Elvis's performing career. He stepped back from center stage and gave the sweet inspirations the spotlight for a full song, not as background to his lead, but as the featured performers. They sang People Get Ready, the Curtis Mayfield gospel soul classic about liberation and hope. And they sang it with everything they had, pouring out emotions that had been building for years of performing in the shadow of racism. Years of being treated as less than they were. Elvis stood behind them during that performance. Not singing, just standing there as a visible sign of support, occasionally adding a harmony line, but mostly letting them have the moment. The crowd listened in a hushed, reverent silence that was completely different from the energetic applause of a typical concert. This felt more like church than entertainment, more like witnessing something sacred than watching a show. When the sweet inspirations finished, the standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and M.N.A. Smith later said it was the most powerful moment of her entire career. The rest of the concert had a different quality than a typical Elvis show. The energy was more subdued, but somehow more meaningful. Elvis introduced each member of the Sweet Inspirations by name and gave brief tributes to what they had contributed to music, turning what would normally be quick acknowledgments into genuine moments of recognition. He told stories between songs about growing up in Mississippi, about the black musicians who had influenced him, about his mother, Gladys, working alongside black women, and the friendships she had formed. He was using his platform not just to entertain, but to educate, to help his audience understand that the music they loved was inseparable from the black culture that had created it. The immediate aftermath of the Montgomery concert was complex and multi-layered. News of what had happened spread quickly. First through word of mouth as attendees called friends and family, then through local newspaper coverage, and eventually through national media outlets. The headline in the next day's Montgomery Advertiser read, "Elvis takes stand on race at concert." And the article described the incident and Elvis's response in detail. Within days, the story had been picked up by newspapers across the country with reactions falling along predictable lines based on the political leanings of the publications and their readers. For Elvis personally, there were immediate professional consequences. Several southern venues that had been tentatively scheduled for future tours quietly informed his management that they were no longer interested in hosting him. Radio stations in certain markets reduced their Elvis rotations or stopped playing his music altogether. Colonel Parker was reportedly furious, not because he disagreed with what Elvis had done morally, but because he saw the financial implications. Letters poured into Elvis's fan club offices with about 60% expressing support for his stance and 40% expressing anger, disappointment, or outright hatred. Some of the negative letters were so vicious, so filled with racial slurs and threats that they had to be turned over to law enforcement. But there were positive consequences, too, perhaps more significant in the long run. The sweet inspirations, who had been well known in certain circles, but not mainstream stars, suddenly found their profile elevated significantly. They were invited for interviews on television shows, profiled in magazines, and offered recording opportunities that might not have come their way otherwise. Within the music industry, Elvis's stand had ripple effects. Other white artists who featured black performers began to speak more openly about racial issues, perhaps emboldened by Elvis's example. The incident became a case study in how to handle racism when it erupts in public spaces. Not by ignoring it or trying to smooth it over, but by confronting it directly and making clear what values you stand for. Entertainment venues began implementing clearer policies about acceptable behavior, and some artists began including explicit anti-discrimination clauses in their performance contracts. For Elvis himself, the Montgomery concert seemed to crystallize something that had been forming in his mind for years. He had always been uncomfortable with the way he was credited as the creator of rock and roll when he knew he was building on foundations laid by black artists like Arthur Crudup, Big Mama Thornton, and countless others. He had been quietly generous with money, helping black musicians who were struggling, but he hadn't been particularly public about his views on race. Montgomery changed that. In interviews following the concert, Elvis began speaking more openly about his debt to black music and black culture. He used his platform to